Hello, I'm Elizabeth, general partner at Scribble Ventures. Here we're joined by Kristen, partner and longtime friend, also a former CMO. But the star of the show today, we're joined by Lee Applbaum, first and foremost, a great friend, but also co-founder at Round Two Spirits, former CMO of one of my favorites, Patron Bacardi, and then prior to that, even WheelsUp, Target, Radio Shack, and I just learned David's Bridal. Oh my, I can't wait to dive into all of these things. And also a phenomenal cyclist, which, we can weave in some Radio Shack fun there. Lee's built iconic companies in obviously the spirits category, transportation, electronics, but also from everything else, shoes to sandwiches, wedding gowns to electronics. So, why? We're going to dive right in. Why do we do this, first of all? So when we took a step back and looked at our Scribble portfolio founders, we realized that they were building phenomenal companies as their day jobs, but then there was some extra superpower that made them really unique and frankly weird. And we've had some Rubik's Cube champions, some world-class video gamers that made their living doing that, musicians, all sorts of things. So then we took a step back and said, let's look at our Scribble network and the advisors to our companies, the people that we really learn from. And that led us to Lee. We figured that group had some phenomenal superpowers and experience as well. So that's where we find ourselves today. So we're going to dive into all things. Lee is going to impart some wisdom and we'll go from there. Sound good, everyone?
Awesome.
All right. Well, first of all, this is a big debated question. As we're often just looking at the tech initially and how great of caliber that founder is. But how does brand matter for early stage startups? And how should today's founders really think about brand and marketing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And first of all, thanks for inviting me. I mean, after the sort of the brief on some of your prior guests, I'm not quite the Renaissance man that you described, not going to win any Rubik. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever solved a Rubik's Cube. I don't know. I'm ashamed to admit that. Not really that competent at video games, and can't play the guitar, although I'm trying to learn. So not sure what my superpower is, but I have been very fortunate to work with and be a part of some iconic global brands, and have spent my my entire career there, and that is really the old adage, if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. I sort of feel like I've been blessed that way. Every day at work is never a perfect day, or most days are not. But I love brands, and I have this kind of broad belief, Elizabeth, that brands matter, and they matter in every vertical, and they matter at every stage of a product or service's existence, right? From inception through its maturation. And it matters in different ways. And I know we'll probably explore that over the course of our chat today. And whether that brand matters in B2C, so very traditional consumer branding, which is where I've spent my career for the most part. There's some adjacencies in B2B. Whether that brand matters for the end user consumer of your product or your service, or for adjacencies that aren't often necessarily thought of. So think about the investor community that I know we're going to talk about today, right? Brands are accretive, and they create value. They create value for the end user consumer. So we make decisions on the coffee we purchase, or the cars we drive, or the brand of mobile device that we use. Brand is shaping all of that. But it also matters in the investment choices that we make and the places that we work as well, right? And by the way, our personal branding as well. My background and experience, you shared that briefly, that is my personal brand. And my personal brand is made up of who I am, but really about my experiences. And those experiences in some ways are going to be curated by what I put out there on social media, how I talk about myself even today. And that's all going to shape people's perceptions of me, ultimately the way they value me, and that's my brand. And so I say all that as we think about a startup. the brand begins the moment that that product or service begins, right? That is where the brand is initiated, and it's important because I think about branding like, the old chess versus checkers analogy. It is chess, and it's thinking 20 steps ahead, Elizabeth. Where do I want my brand to be as I think about the consumer, as I think about the potential investor, as I think about even things like really far down the road, think about as I take the company public, because the market is going to think about not only the balance sheet, it's not only going to think about the revenue stream or EBITDA or classic, very kind of left brain ways of thinking about an investment. They're going to be looking at the brand, and how many businesses and things do we invest in because of the brand? And I think even granted, albeit with very mature companies, Warren Buffett, sort of the classic stalwart, right, talks a lot about that and about not the irrational decisions that he makes. He's a very rational investor in a lot of ways, but the blue chips that he's investing in, a lot of that rests on the value of the brand and the brand equity and what that says about the product or service, not just about the underlying financials. And so I think as we think about startups, one of the very early considerations, I would argue, along with the requisite business plan and all the things that you do, is what does our brand stand for? And those will be things like, mission and vision and values, things that are often thought of as very esoteric and often, maybe later stage, more mature. I think those are things that a startup has to begin to anticipate very, very early on. And things like, what are our North Star? All those things ladder up to what is the brand.
Now, that's a great point. And I think talking to so many early stage founders, they're so focused on the technology and that breakthrough and the unlock. And like, oh, but it's all tech. The rest will come later. What is that, what are those lessons around? When should you start that? When should you start thinking it? And what are some of the non-obvious lessons that you should really implement earlier stage, I would assume?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. And you find this in a lot of industries, and certainly with tech, that the focus is on the technology, right? I don't care if that's code or that's hardware, the service that it provides. But remember, and I learned this from a mentor back in my Coca-Cola days, which is, we think about classic, you think about, with products and services, the classic feature benefit model, right? It's like, here's the feature of my product, right? And then marketing talks about the benefit. But the truth of the matter is that brands aren't really built on the benefit either. And this is the genius of Steve Jobs and Apple. You have to pull out the Steve Jobs reference, right? Like, if you want to have any credibility. I mean, what Jobs understood with Apple was, it's not about the technology. It's not about the chipset, the feature. And it's not even about the benefit. So you might say, I've got the, what is it, the M1 or M2, whatever the generation chip is, right? I've got this chip, and this chip will process transactions at X speed. That's the benefit. But that's not why consumers are ultimately buying it. They're buying it because it's what that benefit does for them. So when I worked at Coke, we used to talk about not the what, but the so what. And that's what the brands are built on. It's the so what. So the genius of Apple isn't that the M1 chip does X with processing. It's that what that processing allows is, take during COVID, for grandparents and grandkids to be connected via high definition video with crystal clear sound over thousands of miles when they couldn't see each other for a year and they were separated. And so it's not about just the technology, but the so what of that technology. And that's what, the world's best and most iconic brands so clearly communicate. And even technology, which at its very core, right, the code of it is very cold. It's ones and zeros, or the technology, it's silicon, right? But so it might seem like, yeah, let's focus all our energy on that's the brand, but that's not the brand. The brand are the very human connections. And it's not necessarily as emotive as connecting a grandchild and a grandma, that's very sweet, right? but it may enable businesses to do things that they simply couldn't do before, individuals to do things that they couldn't do before. And those kind of transformational things that this technology can do is how the brand needs to be thinking about how it communicates. And I often cite, granted, it's an iconic and a big and a mature technology company, but think about Intel, right? Intel, pretty, at least from where I'm sitting, pretty boring business. It's chips. Like, so what? But what the marketers at Intel recognized, now a couple decades ago, I'm dating myself, right, is that they built this Intel Inside platform, right? That you can even talk to layperson consumers and get them to care about the chipset that is in their laptop, right? And they built an entire brand around a technology that most people, the consumers, certainly don't understand. But what that compelled me to do as a consumer was to go, when I was buying, brand X laptop, right, to go, well, is there Intel inside? Why? I don't know how fast the processor is. I don't know what it allows me to do, but it was accretive and it created a halo. And now what that did is, instead of pushing the technology, it created a consumer pull. So now consumers were going to stores and to retailers and going, well, does it have an Intel? And now the OEMs, call it Dell or whomever, are going, well, I've got to have Intel inside because my consumer's asking for it. So again, it's a very mature example, but it's a focus on how even the most sort of very utility brand, right, can make very human connections and create a value proposition that ultimately drives value.
Totally. And that so what is so key, because I think even at my first interaction with founders that may or may not become Scribble founders, that fundraising piece, like, so what? And I try to why you, why this, but so what? So why does it matter to me? So that's a great point.
And it's funny because I think technologists like to talk to other technologists, right? And so you get in a room and everybody kind of geeks out about it, and that's great. And that's the very rational side of investing, or certainly whether you're, when you're raising capital. But as I said, there's a very emotional side too. And so we as investors or as consumers are not only processing the what, right? I got it. Now I got the benefit. I understand it. You've laid out the features for me, understand them. I understand the benefits. But when you make that so what connection, and that so what connection is a very human one. It's not necessarily, as I said, emotive, but if it's a SaaS product, if it's whatever it is, it's a product that's going to help my business do what better. It's going to help my consumers do what better, faster. And that is that so what moment. And that is not necessarily the most rational moment, to be frank.
What do you think that human connection is with the Intel example? It's such a good example because it is a utilitarian product. And as you said, it doesn't have to be emotive, but there is an emotion that you're conjuring up. And so how do you think about that Intel example?
Yeah. And what Intel, I think, did really well and continues to do is to tie it back to how people are using not only their chipset, but the computing power of that chipset. So for gamers, you take my teenage son, it's not about how fast the chipset is. He's not an expert, but I'll tell you what he does know. He noticed whether there's a glitch in the game, right? The clarity of the video, the speed at which it processes. And I think what Intel did is they found a number of sort of use cases, whether they were in gaming or in other verticals. And I know they had some very tailored campaigns for specific applications in engineering and life sciences that were all about, how that computing power benefits. In some cases, it could be lofty humanity, or in some cases, it can be an 18-year-old kid, right? But they were very emotional connections. And again, I think that was and they continue to do that. And you see, I think that was one of the very early companies that did that. But you see companies doing that now. I mean, there are technology companies advertising in the Super Bowl, right? And not necessarily, it's interesting when you think about the audiences that they're talking to about their brand. They're talking to a bunch of parallel audiences. They're talking to the end user, right? So if it's like it's Intel, I don't pick what chipset goes in my computer, but they're talking to that end consumer. They're also talking to the OEMs who are going to have their chipsets embedded in their technology. And you're seeing that happen. You're seeing Salesforce. I mean, you think about Salesforce, right? It is this ubiquitous global brand. There are a lot of people that don't even understand what the hell Salesforce really is or what it does at an excruciating level of detail, but they've built I would argue, iconic brand, a brand with a ton of equity that certainly has created tremendous amount of shareholder value that sits above and beyond just the value of what the Salesforce platform actually does. And it creates a situation where you have businesses that don't even understand the core technology saying, well, you want Salesforce? Do you run Salesforce? Because there is that halo equity.
Yeah, that's great. Now let's take a step back. We go from Super Bowl to what happens when you're a broke startup and you don't have $1 million for a few seconds. What are some of those key things that you would do as a on ramen starving founding team that's really trying to make, that any initial funding last a very long time?
Right. And by the way, don't knock ramen. I think no matter how many commas you have in your net worth, I think ramen always has a important place.
I agree.
Right? I mean, one of the world's great foods. But thousands of years have proven that, by the way. We just figured it out like in the West a few, decades ago. But that's a great question, Elizabeth. And when I'm often asked about this, it's, well, yeah, surely, you worked at Coca-Cola. It's got, $185 billion of, enterprise value in the brand. We could barely pay our electrical bills. And there has been a real transformation in the way in which brands is built, not ironically, by tech, right? I mean, today's brands are built faster than they've also, by the way, been destroyed faster than ever, but they are built faster than ever because of the largely earned media ecosystem side of digital. Social media and digital media has transformed the way in which brands are built. The brands that I'm building today, and very specifically the one that I and my partners are involved with, is entirely being built on a digital backbone, entirely. The days of big above the line media, I wouldn't say they're gone, but I would say, interestingly enough, that's how brands used to be built. And today, I think that the splashy TV or the splashy, traditional media is more reserved for big, established, iconic brands that are more conspicuous in their absence than anything, right? So they kind of have an obligation to advertise and to spend that money. And Kristen, you have a CMO background, so you know this well. But I think that the startup environment and the ability to build brands at a very low cost in a very targeted and very creative way is built on digital, and again, and built on earned media. And oh, by the way, it used to be that the creation of the creative itself that you would put on these platforms cost you money. But look, AI is now allowing us to create remarkable creative at incredibly low cost, at tremendous speed, at staggering levels of quality. I mean, some of the stuff that's coming out now, AI generated creative, is remarkable. Yeah. But I think I guess the long answer to the short question is that cost is not the barrier. The barrier is understanding your consumer and then just being flat out creative. And creative doesn't reside with Wyden Kennedy in Portland. Creative resides with the founder, Spark, right? It's understanding that, so what, making those connections, and then being really thoughtful about leveraging particularly the earned media ecosystem to target that consumer message. Look, building brands always has a bit of a lightning in a bottle component, right? Particularly with earned media. But I think that a really smart, sharp, PR plan combined with social media, combined with very targeted, some case paid media, but again, paid media, performance media that can be done on a shoestring budget, has allowed startups to be more effective, to garner more attention, measured as impressions, for example, to get better open and click through and real engagement than we've ever seen before. And that's why you're seeing, particularly in the consumer packaged goods world, the creation of brands at a speed that has never been seen before, and the ability for small upstart brands to grab material share from big blue chip brands at staggering speed. And it frankly is a huge advantage because startups aren't encumbered by the policies and practices and kind of, pardon my language, bullshit of big corporate firms that have to run things by CMOs and by big legal, and by a panel of 20 people and a board who all has to vote on the messaging. Startups have the agility, they have the lack of bureaucracy. The risk profile is very different than a more mature company. And the beauty of the digital ecosystem is your ability to test and learn at incredible speed. And, the great thing is the world in which you play is this is a native environment for technology folks, right? Like, you take like old salty dogs like me, I've learned it over time, but when I started my career, it was like, digital was this new thing. I'm like sheepish to admit that I got my first email address in grad school, folks. Like, that's terrifying. But the individuals that you're working with were born and raised, and this is what they do. It is a very, very comfortable ecosystem for them. And so whenever I hear founders talk about, well, we don't have the big budgets, what I really hear them saying is, well, we don't have is the creativity. Because that's what it takes, is it's the creativity. And no one knows their business. No one really knows that North Star vision better than the founders. Like, there's no agency that's going to be able to do that better. The agency may be able to help shape and refine that messaging, may be able to find a more creative spin on that. But these are people who know the heart and soul of what they're trying to do better than anyone.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead, Elizabeth. Go ahead.
So we met 15 years ago nearly, and you were the CMO at Radio Shack, and it was exactly what you said. We were launching Twitter's ad platform. We knew it was shaky and scary, and no one had ever put, there were no such thing as Twitter ads yet. And we decided to select 5 brands that were leaning into technology to experiment. And it was because you and your team were there to be like, we don't know what we're going to know. We're going to try this thing out. And that is, the way you started seeing phenomenal lift of all things a brand, Radio Shack, that you wouldn't think would be like a big Twitter, newsy stuff.
Right.
But it makes me think, for these founding teams, when should you make that first marketing hire? Like, so many founders think that person is just a panacea and it's going to launch the company to the moon. But I'm with you on it. Like, you need that creative spark from that founding team.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's this new model, and it's maybe not so new anymore, these fractional CMOs that sort of exist. I would absolutely not go out and hire and again, what's a CMO in title anyway, right? But necessarily have a full-time marketer on staff, but being able to, and that may take the form of, as you think about your advisory board, right? It's interesting. And I sit as an advisor, as you know, Elizabeth, on several boards. And oftentimes I'm the only marketer in the room, which is great, right? Because I feel like the smartest person in the room by default. But I'm often surprised by the composition of advisory boards. It's very, very, look, I get it. You want to have, a lot of very strong left brain finance folks in there. I get it. But like, how many does it take to screw in a light bulb, right? Like, how many finance folks do you need, right? How many industry folks do you need? I'm shocked often at how few folks there are in the room from the more kind of right brain brand side. And that can be a sort of freeway, frankly, free meaning no cost, not freeway, right? Highway, no cost way to have advisors on board who have a vested interest in the success of the business and brand, who bring all that experiential capital to the table.
Yeah.
But then
Without-
you have these, kind of fractional marketing roles where you can get these, marketers for hire that can provide, as needed ad hoc support. A lot of times it's just helping startups, particularly where you don't have native marketers, create the framework for how to take their words, take the features and benefits and transform them into the so whats. Begin to think about how do we really codify and express our mission and our vision in a way that will be compelling, that an investor community will really be moved to, right? Not just here's a product, here's the pitch deck, but they want to hear that vision. And I think a really good marketer can help them articulate that in a way that, gets the hair to stand up on your arm a little bit, even for the most utility, software or product or service to capture their imagination. And so I think, I don't know what that right time is. I have seen, interestingly enough, I think some companies get ahead of themselves, hire a marketer, and then they get really frustrated because, well, the marketer doesn't have a whole lot to do. Oftentimes, and I'm not suggesting that we as marketers are one-trick ponies, but I don't know what necessarily tangential value we can always add, right? So I would be very careful. I would look to lean into advisors, to friends of, to fractional marketing, marketers to be able to help organize the team around some of those formative marketing things. And then even, listen, if there are a few dollars to do small media buys or to think about an earned media strategy, I think, a really great marketer with a love for this company or for the brand or service or product or service would be worth their weight in gold.
One of the experiences I've had is, I think in marketing for startups at the early stage, there's sort of this hunger to just get right in there and start doing, and maybe a lack of patience for thinking about it and thinking about your positioning. And so just kind of taking a big step back, what is brand? Like if we were to define brand, what does it mean? And I would say also a common adage in early stage tech is the brand is the product. It's the same thing. And so how would you think about that?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And, I think about brands really two ways. You have brand intrinsics and brand extrinsics. So the brand intrinsics are the product is the brand, right? And the example I always give is, Coca-Cola. We could use Patron, obviously was a brand of mine as well. At the end of the day, Coca-Cola is brown sugar water. It's delicious, but it's not really good for you, right? We've all seen they drop the teeth in the Coca-Cola and they're not there like 2 days later. And it causes like obesity and diabetes and all these terrible things, right? But at the end of the day, it's brown sugar water. And by the way, Pepsi is brown sugar water. And if anybody in the audience is from Chicago, might know RC Cola, it's brown sugar water, all brown sugar water. But those are the brand intrinsics, right? That is what the product or service is, the intrinsics. The extrinsics, that's the gift wrapping, right? That is the Tiffany blue box, our brand extrinsics. It can include things like packaging and those sort of things, but it also is how people think about your brand and how your brand is positioned. And so if we think about Coca-Cola and bring enjoyment and refreshment to the world, when I say Coca-Cola, that's what we think about, the extrinsics of the product, right? And you have to really have both. You have to have, and in some cases, extrinsics matter more. In some cases, intrinsics matter a hell of a lot more. Let's go to Tiffany. I just gave, again, I'm using luxury brands. I mean, a diamond is a diamond is a diamond chemically, right? Like it is geologically, a flawless diamond is a flawless diamond. There is no difference. If I put it in a blue box and I give it to somebody, it's a very different proposition than if it came in a cardboard box, right? With a Target logo on it. Another great brand I had an opportunity to work for, but very different. The brand extrinsics say something very different about the diamond's intrinsics. Tiffany understands that very, very well, right? And so when you're talking about technology, and I'm really glad you brought this up, the tendency is to spend all of the time on the intrinsics, and they are critically important. And I would argue in tech more important than certainly than my Coca-Cola example or a Patron example. It's critically important because it's like, does the thing do what the thing is supposed to do, right? At the end of the day, to the Intel example, we could talk about all the fancy numbers with speed, but at the end of the day, if the chipset doesn't do what the chipset says it doesn't do, right, or doesn't do what it says it's going to do, we have a critical failure, right? But conversely, if we don't have the extrinsics, we don't have a brand, right? We don't have an emotional connection to that product or service. And what we also lack is the accretive value creation, right? Coca-Cola, one thing, my guy I worked for at Coca-Cola, he's kind of a now infamous CMO, Sergio Zeman, right, at Coke. Sergio asked me very early on in my career at Coke, he would say, hey, kid, he said, you know the difference between brown sugar water and Coca-Cola? I said, no. He said, $85 billion.
Mm-hmm.
And that stuck with me my entire career because that is the accretive power of brand. It isn't the sugar water. And I think, you know, for folks listening in today going, well, yeah, I get it, but I don't do brown sugar water and I'm not doing Coca-Cola. The same lesson applies. You have an inherent value that's attached to the product or the service, right? And the intrinsics have got to be unassailable. And by the way, I'm a very firm believer in having those unassailable intrinsics. Elizabeth knows well from my time at Patron. You know, craft spirits is a wild world. Everybody says, you know, small batch, handcrafted, you know, all of these terms are thrown around. Most of it is all BS. But at Patron, we took those intrinsics really seriously. We wanted to make sure that if we were put to the grindstone, put your hand on the Bible and raise your right hand, do you have integrity in what you say, right? And for a startup, you've got to make sure that that product, that service absolutely meets, if not over delivers, all the critical specifications that are promised. No question. Those are the intrinsics.
Yeah.
But there is an exponential value creation opportunity when you get to the extrinsics of that product. Absolutely.
One more question. How do you think about that in terms of, like, you know, in tech, Paul Graham famously said, build things people want, which was a great line. You can't argue with it.
Right.
But I think there's this sort of feeling that if you build something that people want, you don't have to work any harder than distributing your product and working on your distribution channels. You don't have to think into the intrinsic properties of the product. And that furthermore, if you do, then maybe it's manipulative. And so how do you think about the sort of, and I think this is a very like internal feeling for a lot of people in tech, you know, how do you kind of, you know, grapple with that?
Boy, that's a really provocative question. First of all, I don't think that great marketing is manipulative, by the way. It can be. It's not, let me be clear, it's not inherently manipulative. If obviously, if it doesn't have integrity, if it's representing the product or service differently than its ability to deliver, that is manipulative. But, you know, we've evolved over millions and millions of years, but to steal the line from, you know, Maya Angelou, we're more alike than we are different, my friend. I mean, there are some very, very basic human triggers that marketing leans into and leverages the human condition. And so it's funny, I take it, not that you were trying to get me bristly, but when people say, but you're manipulating, I said, no, I'm not. I'm just tapping into millions of years of human evolution. And there are things that human triggers that we respond to. We just do. And by the way, we're responding to them in the most kind of simple kind of, again, I refer to it as utility tech. I mean, sort of not sexy and flashy. and we respond to it the first time that we saw an iPhone, right? It is that same response. And how we choose to package it, how we choose to communicate it, the visuals we use, the language we use to surround it isn't manipulative, right? It's how we get human beings to pay attention. Like there's no chance that Apple, and it's so, I hate going back to it. It's so boring, but it's so relevant, right? Like we go back to 1984 because it wasn't about the product, but they were connecting with a very, very human base emotion that then gave the tech an opportunity to connect with the consumer. So if you can't make those kind of extrinsic, human, not manipulative, but behavior shaping, like if you can't do that, you may never get an opportunity to talk about all the amazing code that you wrote. Like seriously, or the amazing product that you built. And so I see this again, it's not endemic to tech. I see it in spirits, see it a lot in consumer packaged goods. Founders are so close to that product, right? They're so close to it. And they love to geek out on every little detail of the science of it, but you're just not going to get somebody to pay attention till you make those sort of longer evolutionary like connections that get people to pay attention, quite frankly, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I feel like people want it. People want to feel emotions, even about my iPhone. I want to feel something strong about this. I can't tell you why. It's because I'm a human, but I asked it that way because I think it is something that people just generally feel in our world. And I feel like it really holds them back. And when I think about all the great startups that I helped along the way, that we funded, almost all of them, the founders were just, they were just so good at connecting with their community and connecting with their customers in a really human way. And it didn't matter what kind of company it was. And so, yeah, tapping into that human piece of it it's critical.
Well, and I think if you took the description of a business and you just wrote, or a brand, and you wrote it down on paper, what does it do? And then you sort of wrote on the left side, on the right side, you wrote, the brand, right? So Airbnb, write what Airbnb actually does. And you're sort of like, want, right? Like, okay. I mean, I get it. And it does have look, you have a feature, got it. There's an absolute benefit and there's an absolute so what for Airbnb. But what Brian and that team did, they don't think about it in terms of the utility of an Airbnb, right? They're thinking about it with the best, whether it's luxury brands, with the best travel brands. I mean, the positioning of their creative is travel and leisure and Condé Nast, and not about what you would write, what Airbnb does on paper. And while I'm sure they've done the exercise on what is the accretive value of the Airbnb brand that sits on top of that, or maybe we compare Airbnb to Vrbo, right? And then go, and by the way, what is Vrbo doing right now?
Same thing.
Yeah, chasing
company.
Airbnb, right? Like that's what they're doing. But at the end of the day, you don't see either talking about like our tech is better. They're talking about the human condition. Like, do you really want to share a room with this person? Like, do you really want? They're getting to these and they're playing it through humor. They're playing to a little bit of fear, right? Like, yeah, no, I don't want my kids like in a compromised potential shared location. Like those aren't manipulative, but they're getting to the human condition. And at the end of the day, they do the same damn thing, right? At the core, but it's not about features and benefits. It's like the so what?
And even for early stage founders, make me want to evangelize even that Salesforce tool or whatever you're doing. But yeah. Well,
absolutely. I always, this is like such a base thing, but I always go like, would someone want to rock your logo on a piece of swag, right? Like you always give founders always give stuff away, right? So it's like, oh, I got the hoodie or the whatever it is, or the Yeti. And I'm like, people don't rock the logo because of the enterprise value. They don't like, oh, look, it's a unicorn. Like they don't. They do it because the brand, that logo says something about you, right? It's about a halo for you. And so I always ask the question, would someone want to rock your logo? Would they? And why? And why? And it doesn't have to be because it's a cool brand, right? Cool is different. And it doesn't certainly have to be because it's a luxury or a boutique brand. It's because it's a brand that makes a connection and it says something about who you are. Ask that question. Someone want to rock your logo?
I love that. I love that. I'm totally going to use that. One of the things that I do with founders is I have them each share their favorite product that they would evangelize. And then I say why. And then they list off usually like, oh, this backpack has these features and this and this. And I'm like, but does the competitor not have that? And it kind of stumps everybody because they're like, wait a second. Maybe I don't actually know the reason why I love that backpack as compared to the competitor. So you have to go a level deeper to get there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And listen, the other thing is that I didn't touch on earlier, but I think is critically important is, right, brands convey trust, right? They convey trust. And when you're dealing with, technology, and certainly as I do in my limited role, but as I deal with it, I've got to trust the technology I'm using, that I'm embedding in my business and our business systems, that I'm relying on personally, right? That could be hardware, that could be software. I've got to trust it. And brands convey that trust. Certainly, and by the way, when I say brands, that's not only the company brand, that's the brand of the founder. I started off by talking about my brand, right? It's the brand of all of those people that are accretive. And I think it's very easy for people to dismiss offhand brand, but when you start unpacking it, as we're doing today, and you're like, oh, wait, you're right. It does. So when I'm making a decision, when I'm telling somebody, when somebody says, hey, what's your payroll system? And I tell them what I use for payroll or for banking or for cybersecurity, right? For data security and privacy. And I have a no-name product versus a well-established data security platform. That says something to my customers, to my partners, because I trust in that platform. That platform now has a halo in my business. So brands matter. Going back to they absolutely matter.
Great. That's a perfect transition to looking at some brands that we've seen in the limelight that matter, and some bigger ones. Kristen, do you want to take away kind of a fun idea to look at some of these?
Yeah, so we're going to start. I'm going to share my screen.
Awesome.
We're going to start with
So you've got to be Johnny on the spot gut reaction to some of these.
Some I might not know. I mean, I live in my dark cave where it's very.
Yeah.
Got it.
Well, I think you'll know Stripe, but we just thought it'd be interesting to kind of go through here and just kind of talk through our impressions of the brand. We of course don't know what goes on behind the scenes, but as brand people looking at this, I'm just going to kind of scroll.
I mean, first thing you see, right, is it's obviously they're using customers as halo, which is, and by the way, those customers all have in Amazon and Salesforce and Google, right? You've got tremendous equity right there, right? You sit there and go, holy smoke, right? Like it's the company you keep, and they've very intelligently above the fold, like leveraged that.
Totally. Yeah. And then scrolling down.
Then you might not even know, like you said, what Stripe does, but you're probably like, I know they're kind of like they power a lot.
Yeah.
And look, I mean, you look at their color palette, we're getting very right brain designy, but softer pastels and colors. Finance, we think of what? Red and black, right? That's what finance is, right? Like you want to be in one color and not in the other color, but they purposefully are having much softer, much more approachable color palette, which again, you'd say, well, the audience they're talking to, does it matter? You say, yeah, it does. Because what this conveys to me is approachable and ease of use and, again, sort of friendly.
Yeah. And a positioning, they've had this since early on. I remember when they got this kind of like diagonal line right here. It was all the rage in tech. And the reason I say for positioning is because they, initially were just selling to developers. And so they didn't have to do this, but it felt to me like they were setting up to selling to much bigger enterprises, and a range of different personalities, but they still kept, the sense that you're in the product, you have the engine open and you're looking in.
That's a great observation. It's funny as you say that now, I'm right there with you. Yeah.
It almost looks like you're looking at the engine of a car, kind of.
Awesome. Okay, next one. Let's wrap up. I
Next,
love gut reaction.
Oh,
everybody's favorite right now, OpenAI.
yeah. And what a great transition, like with Sora, like from, I mean, the 1.0, which was clearly not brand, right? It was just like a really bright guy who could do and now look at it. And what obviously they're leaning into with what Sora is doing with some of those videos that are mind-blowing. And we definitely should park some time, if you have it, to talk about AI's impact on creative dev, which is mind-blowing. But yeah, I mean, if we could have brought up OpenAI's, even site a month or 2 months ago, right? So much more utilitarian, so much more just felt very academic. And now look at this.
Yeah, right away I get magic, these paper airplanes that are flying like colorful birds.
Right.
It democratized where we can all make a paper airplane.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say the irony, but the beauty that we also know it was created by the very product that they're talking about, right? So we're watching the actual fruits of the sort of the AI engine with these paper airplanes that we know are Sora, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is
The AI
kind of amazing.
Yeah. AI has the potential to make the world more beautiful, more magical, more special. And still leaning into these sort of research and trust angles. I mean, they have safety right up at the top.
Right. But this would be, I mean, and look on the left, you've got what, looks like an oil painting on the left. And I mean, this would almost be indistinguishable from a site of a fine art museum and yet it's as tech as tech comes.
Oh, that's such a great, yeah, I could imagine they might have even used that as a template for the site, because it really does feel like you're on the MoMA.
Yeah, a MoMA site for sure.
Yeah,
I mean,
there we go.
Like you sit and you look at it and I think this is getting to, you've sort of helping proving my sort of esoteric, features, benefits, and so what's, right? The so what is what we're seeing here, right? The benefits we could have articulated in a much simpler way, but the so what we're seeing very much come to life here in the art.
That's fantastic. Elizabeth, what's the next one?
Oh, let's see here. We've got next up. Oh, I'm wondering if we should jump ahead. Let's do liquid death.
Oh, so great.
Talk about sugar water. This is just plain water.
Water. Yeah. What a genius it is. And so it is all extrinsics and about connecting to a consumer. I don't know if they do it anymore. We'd have to look, but they used to have did you remember that when you, instead of just like joining their loyalty program or providing your data, you would sign like your life away, right? You'd sign a contract, and it was this, or there it is, sell your soul. There it is on the
so
top
funny.
now. I mean, yeah, like how genius is that? It is still there. It was there. If not day one, I might not have my facts right. Very, very early on. But this is such a great example. And oh, by the way, built digital first, right? I mean, this brand was built through both digital and earned media. It wasn't running $7 million Super Bowl ads. It wasn't paying, Ryan Reynolds to go, endorse the product. Not knocking, by the way, celebrity endorsements are just extremely expensive. I mean, it's just tapping into an ethos that, was anti-Evian, anti-Fiji. They are their own thing. It's absolutely genius.
Oh, that's great. Oh, and I don't know, I like so much of even the color palette, like water is so fresh and light, and they're taking the opposite, like this dark, taking us. How are things really changing? What are you excited about? What worries you as a phenomenal marketer? And more.
Yeah, so I'm one of these folks who I love what's going on with AI as it relates to marketing specifically. Despite all of the, potential perils of AI, and that's a whole other discussion, one that I'm in the audience on those, right? And I need a translator for half of the discussions. But I love what's going on in the sense that, marketers now have the ability to create faster. And I think in some ways, I don't know if I want to say better, but I think work that they certainly can create work faster. And I think they can create some quality work faster that in some ways is vetted. And when I say it's vetted, right, it used to be you'd say, hey, I have an idea for a brand name, right? And then what did you have to do? You had to start taking it out to endless focus groups and find statistically significant samples, and you'd have to talk to this group and that group, and you'd have to go east and west and north and south. I mean, I can go onto an engine and say, give me a brand name with the following parameters, right? And as you know, you can be hyper specific in how you put these queries into place. I can have AI run some of the traps for me against different demography, different kinds of psychography, and it can do a lot of that work and kick out a short list of 5, 6, 7 potential brand names. And those brand names may not ultimately be the brand name that sits on a product or service, but maybe they serve as a launch pad for further ideation. I love it. I think some of the copy that AI can do, is it final? Does it lack some of the nuance of a brilliant writer? No, but it can get you 80% of the way there. Drafts 1 through 4 or 5 at speed. And certainly not only for startups, but for smaller firms that don't have armies of creatives, it can allow you to do it really, really quickly. And what we're seeing now, like Sora, is remarkable. I've run through a few demos on that platform in real time and watched the kind of content that it can create. And, people say, well, do you worry about deep fake? Do you worry about this? And do you worry about that? As it relates to advertising, no. I mean, the great advertising, it's not about misleading, but if anybody's going to tell you that that McDonald's burger that you saw in the ad had fake cheese and wasn't real meat and wasn't a real bun, it was just done with plastic, and it was done with acrylic ice cubes in Coca-Cola. This is just leveraging a digital ecosystem to do that work. I think you still have to have integrity in terms of conveying that the product or service does what it says it's going to do. You've got to be sure that, I'm not suggesting that the food that you show looks completely different than the food ultimately that you buy, but it should be the very best version of it. And if AI can create the most beautiful hamburger you've ever seen, I don't know how that's a lot different than a food stylist, using hairspray on lettuce, because nobody should put hairspray on lettuce, but boy, it makes the liquid like beat up just beautifully. So I'm actually a huge advocate. Now, there's a human cost here, and the human cost is copywriters and designers and cinematographers and food stylists. And, and again, I'm just talking in the small advertising and marketing ecosystem. We're thinking about this in every facet, and the impact that AI will have. But I'm responsibly, used. I'm really, really excited. And I think it's going to create some visuals that, again, we're sort of constrained by our own imagination. I think it's going to sort of open that up. And some of the things that I've seen so far have just been, it really excited me. And I've said, gosh, if you can lay that as an extrinsic, ensuring that the intrinsics are still there and have all that integrity, I think you've got an amazing future for the world of marketing and branding.
I love that.
Yeah. And going back to what we started with was, how does a broke startup market? There you go. You have no excuse now.
Yeah. I mean, when Sora moves from whatever phase it is now, when you can type in, build me a 30-second ad with the following criteria. And it puts it out in 2 minutes. You have a 30-second ad that even for a bargain basement agency might cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And each successive edit, it would be untenable. Like it would be. Exactly. I think it's exciting. And that's why I say when I hear people tell me I don't have the money to build a brand, I just go, you just lack the creativity to figure out how to do it. And whether that's the people, whether that's the earned media, whether that's any piece of that marketing ecosystem, just lacking the creativity to figure out a way to get it done. And it's not to get it done with financial capital. That actually to me is the smallest barrier. Creativity is the biggest.
So perfect seg into how we'll wrap up, which is we like to wrap up with resources. So for founders out there, they're saying, wait a second, who are we? What's our brand? Okay, what do we do next? Are there recommendations you have of what they should read, listen to, watch?
Yeah.
To understand that sort of next step of we need to build a brand.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is where I think, look, there are a lot of academic, plenty of academic stuff published that's out there. I mean, listen, you could go to AI and type in, write me a, mission, vision. But this is where there's no substitute for exploring the network of people that they know, trying to find a marketer. So for example, if they're part of the Scribble family, it's, hey, who do you know? And Elizabeth and you, Kristen, might go, hey, we know this guy, Lee Applbaum. Lee, would you spend an hour talking with them? And as you can tell, like marketers, we love talking about what we do. And we love talking about what we do with people who have yet to be evangelized. Like it's what we love. So I would say, find some people in your network or people's network that you can sit down with and get that primer. You don't need a PhD in marketing, right? I think it's just enough to have somebody who cares enough in what you're doing. And I think that I, for example, I do these things a fair amount. And even after just a 30-minute explanation from founders of what is the product, what is the service, inevitably they spend all the time on the features. We pull the benefits out of them, and then we transform the thinking to the so what. We begin to have those conversations, and these are really smart women and men, right, that we're talking to. Like, there's no lack of like IQ here. There's really a lot of intellectual firepower. It usually gets going, but I would say leverage that network. And unlike, I'm not trying to shoot down lawyers here, but unlike people who like charge by the hour, marketers don't usually do that. Like we generally are a pretty good sort about, this, Kristen, right? We want to share the blessing of the wisdom that we gained. And there's a certain healthy ego with marketers about wanting to put our fingerprint on things. So if a founder appeals to a marketer like, hey, and I don't mean financially appeals, I mean just appeals to like, help us think about how we shape this. Maybe it is that next Airbnb or the next Sora or the next whatever. And sometimes just for a marketer going, oh my God, I sat with the founder when we did this, right? To be able to say that, back with, Elizabeth, if I could have said that I had anything to do in the early days with Twitter, when you guys were with Ev and with everybody else, I'd love to have, but I didn't. But that's the ego appeal of a marketer, is to be able to have one strand of DNA in that future, and it doesn't have to be related to having an equity position. I mean, that's a nice thing, don't get me wrong, but the little strand of creative DNA that will always be a part of a brand when it is the next unicorn, that's super cool.
Well, that's perfect. Thank you for being part of the Scribble story as well. And I would say, selfishly, we should have a closed door session on what should we be investing in next in the marketing side with your expertise. So we will close our Zoom and then go riff on that. But thanks again for your time, your wisdom, and really looking forward to sharing more with others in the portfolio and beyond. Thanks so much.
No, thank you. It's a privilege to spend the time. And I appreciate the fact that you all thought enough to talk about brand in an environment that otherwise may not be front and center. So kudos to you all. Appreciate it. I think it's a reflection of, Scribble being kind of next gen in a lot of ways.
Thank you.
Thanks.